Hello, and welcome. I guess not welcome back, but welcome to, for really the first time, Unbounded Conversations, the show where, our goal is to explore what's possible with BSV and the metanet, and try and emphasize especially what are some potential business applications where aspiring entrepreneurs can get a foothold in the space. And obviously, we're a fund, and so we're coming from the perspective of the types of businesses that we're interested in seeing both from a fun standpoint, but also from a world standpoint. What we think will add value, what we think will improve the lives of the masses. I guess is one sort of paternalistic way of talking about the impacts of BSV and the internet. Anyway, enough of that. I'm joined here by Dave Mullen-Muhr and Ryan Wold. Guys, how are you doing?
Doing well.
Hey, good morning. It's early here on the Pacific time zone, so good to see you guys.
Yeah, we caught Ryan on the before work part of the day. So Ryan, why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself, what you do, how you got into the Bitcoin space, and I'll give you some follow-ups from there.
Yeah, so I'm a software developer. I have a lot of background in product management as well, specifically in the public sector. I started my career in local government in an auditor's office doing financial reporting automation and workflow. And from there, it's been sort of a meandering path. I worked at a charter school. I worked at a private company selling SaaS software to government. I worked at a innovation studio working with startups and enterprises doing kind of next generation innovation projects. And then I worked at a large consultancy working with enterprises and governments doing innovation and also replatforming projects. And now I'm employed by the federal government working in the open data portfolio, focusing on citizen feedback and customer experience. And yeah, I got into the Bitcoin space relatively recently, to be honest. I've been watching the space develop for several years. I had some friends who got into mining quite early. They were doing the crate boxes and in the garage sort of thing, and I really didn't get it at the time. And so that they were doing some early stuff with Bitcoin. Then I saw Ethereum come out, and I was like, oh, this is kind of interesting, the smart contract stuff. And I actually tried to play with Solidity and Truffle a bit, and wasn't really a fan of the experience, and it just didn't stick for me at the time. And then I heard about the hack, and that kind of scared me off. And then I saw sort of this like explosion of all these altcoins, and what was interesting about that is just seeing all the different use cases that people thought were a problem. And then ultimately I found BSV. I think this summer, I think June was really when I like jumped in. I heard about the fork, and I didn't really understand what was going on in the space, and uh, yeah, the more I poked at it, the more it sort of stood up to my scrutiny, and it sort of drew my interest in some of the misinformation around it. Was specifically interesting. I was like, huh, what's going on here? Why is there so much you know, you know so much passion about uh, sort of down talking the technology um, and then also sort of the promise of what it was, which was actually getting back to the basics of Bitcoin. That just sort of really appealed to me. And uh, once I had kind of put my hands on the technology, I started running a node, started playing with the BSV library. I was like, oh wow, there's actually something here. I had an experience with Money Button, and then got onto Twitch, and yeah, and sort of from there, I was like, oh wow, like this thing actually, there's something here. The micropayments were a real thing, and ultimately, what it does to the user experience is sort of what hooked me. And then from there, I've gotten into the philosophy of Bitcoin and a lot about economics and incentives, and uh, yeah, it's uh, been quite exciting.
It sounds like several of those jobs you've had have been within the private sector and have touched the public sector in a way where like you're trying to improve efficiency or just get better outcomes. When you found Bitcoin, Ethereum, the whole crypto ecosystem, were you initially thinking about, oh, how can I leverage this technology to improve, what you're working on in your career? Or was it just like an independent interest of yours?
Yeah, it wasn't actually related to the public sector at all. The public sector is traditionally a late adopter of technology. And for me, I have a bunch of side projects. I'm sort of always hacking on something on the side. 3D projects, just all sorts of different stuff. So I was really just sort of looking at it as a curiosity from a technical standpoint. But then, sort of as I sort of come back to BSV, the opportunities in the public space are quite evident to me, especially as I understand the technology better and understand sort of I have a more mature understanding of what the pain points are in government, which aren't necessarily even technology related.
Great. But before we jump into that, I was curious about, as you're describing your career, you mentioned the open data portfolio. Can you explain a little bit more about what that is?
Yeah, so in the public sector, a lot of data is public, and it's so things from financial data, which include transactions, budgets, procurement information, um, things like property tax records. There's just sort of this inherent notion that public data should be public, and um, starting my career in an auditor's office, I was sort of immersed in all sorts of data sets, working on the financial accounting system. But now fast forward, over the last 10 years, I've been really immersed in the civic tech sector, or what's been called open gov or open data, gov tech sometimes. Uh, During that time, there's been a lot of focus on making data available openly, and there's a kind of a suite of products called like open data portals. Like CCAN is one, DCAN is another, Socrata is a private vendor in the space. A lot of agencies just publish links to just data sets online. Sometimes it's machine readable, like CSV or XML or JSON. Lots of times it's really not so friendly, like published in PDFs or docx's or just sort of like just published really basically online in a non-semantic way. So yeah, again, there's this notion that open data should be public, but ultimately, just because it's online doesn't mean it's useful. And there's a set of open data principles that I can kind of share after this, but sort of the qualities that actually constitute open data, because just publishing your data doesn't necessarily make it open and useful. And the theory behind this is number one, to inform the public. It's their information, but how can it drive additional businesses to provide additional value in either the public sphere, the civic sphere, or even the private sector?
So when are we going to see a hash of all these data sets on the blockchain?
Well, I think that's a really good question. You know, lots of these portals. I mean, Seattle has a portal, San Francisco has a portal, Chicago has a portal. I mean, there's tons of different portals. The federal government has a portal, many portals, and we're talking petabytes of data. Tons and tons of data. What's interesting is that the data is already sort of online, and so putting it on chain. That's sort of feature parity from where a lot of people stand. And so looking to figure out why specifically to put it on chain, what would putting it on chain do, and how would that be uniquely valuable, I think is the question. And to be honest, I'm still trying to figure that out. I think there are kind of obvious things about immutability, about high availability. Beyond that, I'm still kind of looking for that aha moment, because ultimately there's cost involved, and with anything there's a trade-off, and we're really looking for the value. And so there's been a lot of investment in open data portals, but in my opinion, they haven't actually reaped the benefits that I think people envisioned to start. There's a lot of talk about data as oil. Well, oil in and of itself isn't that valuable. It's what you do to it. It's how you refine it. It's how you basically make derivative products out of it. And I think open data is the same way. And when we start having pipelines of data being consumed and used and distributed by by companies and ultimately with a broad set of users on the end, then you sort of get into it's a higher leverage argument in order to make to put it on chain. Okay, well we actually do need it immutable. We need it available in real time. These are things that I think will power sort of the next generation of public service delivery in my mind. But when that next generation comes, I think is always the thing I grapple with. I kind of live in the future a bit, and again, the public sector isn't an early adopter of this stuff. So, um, is that next generation in the next 2 to 3 years? Is it 10 years? Is it beyond? That's kind of a hard call. I'm hoping it's as soon as possible.
When you describe the current state of the data portals, it sounds like it's very siloed. Is there much friction, like between a Chicago portal and a San Francisco portal? Would my mind with BSV initially goes to, oh well, if you centralize it all in one database, cross communication and use cases that come from that could be a huge benefit. Do you think that that's a big problem currently, or is it fairly simple to access data from multiple portals and use them together in unique ways?
I would say in that regard, it's definitely siloed, and there's multiple levels of it. So one thing I think about a lot is jurisdictional boundaries, and in the United States we have over 90,000 jurisdictions. Most people think about 50 states, 3,000 counties. I mean, most people don't even think about that, to be honest. But then we have 16,000 towns and cities. We have special districts, school districts, mosquito abatement districts, water districts, all sorts of different sort of sub levels of government. And so something like Chicago versus San Francisco, number one, is it a problem? It kind of depends on your perspective. For better or worse, our government is federated by nature, and so there aren't a whole ton of active use cases right now where somebody would need information from San Francisco and Chicago, unless you think larger than government itself. And I think it's very natural for a citizen to think of government as one, capital G government, that's everything. But somebody who works at Chicago or somebody who's in San Francisco, I don't think they come across use cases on a regular basis where like, oh, I wish I had this other data set. I think that's short-sighted. I think we're going to look back on this and it's going to be obvious that yes, we should have interoperability between these data sets. So that's sort of city to city between states. But ultimately, you get into I'm trying to angle towards where this would be useful. And say California, we have 58 counties. And then there's efforts at the state level and then between multiple counties and also like in the nonprofit sector where there is a need to aggregate this data. Well, how is city A doing versus city B? And in that case, city A and B may have data portals, and if they do, that data is likely not going to be in the same format. It's not going to be readily accessible or interoperable. And then, from there, you can kind of just see that like all of the operational like efficiencies that you would get out of that aren't realized because the information doesn't talk to each other. A lot of times this is downloading a data set, munging it and sticking it into another data set rather than getting like real-time event notifications that you would expect sort of in the private sector. So there's a long tail of use cases that will emerge when people start thinking about their data as a first-class citizen and start to boil away some of their like unintentional complexity or meaningless differentiation. There's a lot of friction around just incompatible data sets, and oh, I publish it in XML and I publish it in JSON, and oh, I use a private vendor who publishes my financial data in this format, and oh, I use a different vendor and they publish it in this format. And it's like, okay, sure, again, it's technically available online, it's open, but is it machine readable? Is it accessible? Is it standardized? Is it um, you know processed in a way that can be um, you know put to good use? And so there are companies poking at this, but I don't know if they're thinking big enough, to be honest.
It sounds like a lot of this is EDI, which is like a whole industry that I wasn't that aware of until exploring further into BSV and seeing how useful it would be for that application. So do you
Yeah.
think like government would implement, different standards or solve this problem on their own? Or is this something that the private sector would solve and lead the way on that the public sector would adopt?
Yeah, so the government won't solve it on their own. I think that's just definitionally like infeasible. Because again, like there's too many governments involved. Cities, states, counties who have at the federal level who have different goals, different constraints. But somebody who's actually done really good work in this space is Google around the Google Transit specification. GTFS, I think, is what it's called. But basically, like, that's how they're able to surface things like travel times for um, public transport in Google Apps or Google Maps. And so they basically worked with a set of jurisdictions on that. They were able to sort of test it out, get feedback, and then they sort of were able to own that standard, which is an open file format. And then vendors kind of got aboard, and then cities got aboard, and it really created this standardized approach. And I think the thing I that always comes to mind in that is, there are technical issues there, but it's really a people problem. It's really a coordination problem. And, just like most standards, it's, yes, there are technical concerns, but a lot of it is just getting in line with the standard. And then because of a common interface, what you can build atop of that is much, much greater.
Yeah, so it strikes me that, a big use case for a lot of this data or is in sort of the research area, both in terms of governments conducting or funding research and also researchers relying on data sets provided by the government. And it kind of leads me to a question I had that's a little bit more general in terms of what is the sort of clearest route from a sales perspective to get governments on board? Is it cost savings for the government? Is it increased productivity for them or their partners? Or how much of a factor is something like trustworthiness to governments, especially like at the local level, state level, in terms of being willing to adopt a sort of newer technology?
Yeah, so what is the value prop of open data? Again, I really like that question. Unfortunately, I don't think it's trustworthiness. There are a lot of laws that exist around sunshine and transparency, and those typically aren't a business driver. The things that typically tend to appeal to governments are things like policy mandates, legal requirements. Having a notion of cost efficiency and cost savings is always great, and it's something that they can't really shake their head at. And ultimately, any sales pitch comes down to the value of what does open data do for me? How does it reduce my costs? But ultimately, one of the costs is risk, and so if there's policy mandates and for example, like accessibility is a big one coming out, and so if there's like data around accessibility and proving that yes, we are accessible, then that addresses their a primary risk that's it's on the books, it's in their mind, and then you can attach a value to it. Like sort of that's kind of the trifecta. Transparency is something that is very much top of mind for me, and I think there are huge derivative values to that in the public sphere. Increasing public trust is, I mean, I don't know if there's actually things that are much more important than that overall, but backing into that from a business case or sales standpoint is quite difficult. So, yeah, trying to meet them where they're at with their their immediate problems, their operational issues, which are typically around policy and data management.
So do you think policy is the best sort of course in terms of trying to get adoption of some sort of, or in terms of trust being the sort of main value prop, do you think policy is the best way to get action?
Not around trust. Again, it's who is the value to. And so I don't know if trust is a primary value of government. It's something that they can't shake their head at, but it's also something that they can't really put a budget line item around. And so I think the strategy is to understand the policy landscape and be able to craft products that bump up to that with a byproduct of transparency. So there are companies like OpenGov that focus on financial data. They're sort of like very generally like a TurboTax for government. And so they publish a lot of financial data online. And so they're meeting an operational need to make budget information accessible and transparent, or actually just accessible and reportable internally. And then as a byproduct, the citizens can access a portal and view this information in a better way than before.
I feel like such a crony now. I'm thinking about what policy can I get passed to get my, blockchain-based civic tech solution purchased by a bunch of, governments within a state or across the country. I mean, it's not necessarily a bad thing, but you can see how that whole process kind of unfolds in a nutshell, where the business maybe precedes the policy. Although if your business is all about transparency, then maybe it's less of a conflict, or a more acceptable conflict of interest.
Yeah, it's a multidimensional game for sure. I think blockchain has a wide, many different value propositions, and there's a large surface area of technology and government, and ultimately just finding their overlaps. And so, yeah, I think starting with with the end goal in mind, to me the end goal isn't blockchain. The end goal is trust and efficiency, but blockchain just happens to be the best tool to achieve that, I think, in the long term. And so, yeah, it'll be interesting to see how the space evolves and sort of what the narratives evolve, in the space. There's been a lot of blockchain sold to government in the last 5 years. I think it's mostly been snake oil, to be honest, but it is still evident that there is a perceived value there, and trying to understand what that value is, around efficiency, around accountability. Again, these are things that governments can't really shake their heads and say no to. Will they deliver on it? Most of these solutions, no, not even close. And again, it's not a technology issue. It's a getting in alignment with the technology. It's working with the technology. So that means changing policies. It means changing operational procedures. It means having discussions with unions about job roles and all of these things that are much beyond a piece of technology that lives on servers in the cloud somewhere. It gets human really quickly, and that the surface area of the human component is often underestimated, and frankly that's short-sighted, and that's something that I'm coming to grips with. Is you can introduce an efficiency that makes a whole class of jobs redundant or unnecessary, and it's not a personal thing, but you know, maybe those people shouldn't be putting stamps on paper all day. You know, maybe it would be better if we could take that public money and, you know, pay them to go, you know, educate around financial matters in a classroom, or, you know, go work in a park somewhere. You know, like, you know, I don't have any issue with the public funds, but it's like ultimately you're refactoring all the operations of government as you introduce these technologies, and that's typically an obstacle. It's not or a bottleneck, I guess, from a system standpoint. So you can introduce this great stuff, but then there are down-term derivative effects that ultimately a stakeholder is going to have a concern for, and being able to address that in an effective way, I think, is something that I'm really looking forward to.
Well, I was just going to ask, since I know we don't have unlimited time, sort of getting into the meat of it, you know, from an entrepreneur's perspective, or how you see it, what are some of the great businesses that you want to see built using BSV, metanet, in the area of civic tech?
Yeah, I think there's a lot of stuff around open data that just makes complete sense. Understanding the economics of that, about putting data on chain, is interesting. The immutability of long term of this data, I think, is also something that's going to be interesting. A lot of public open data records have expirations, so it's like you have to keep something for 7 years or 10 years or 3 years, and blockchain sort of promises that it can be there forever. And just thinking what that looks like in practice, I actually had a chance to ask Craig, how do you handle this? And he said, well, just provably delete the keys. And I was like, well, that's a pretty obvious and elegant solution. It still leaves questions in my mind about, you know, that data is accessible, and I think if it's public, I'm okay with that, but I'm curious how how that's going to play out in policy. So I think open data portals, it just makes a lot of sense right now. You know, there are issues around archives going offline, data going dark. I mean, this has happened in at the federal level in the last few years. This happens at the local level quite often. So having something that's online, distributed, readily available it's an inherently better solution than a city running a data portal and then having to inherit all of that cost on their own. Financial records makes a lot of sense. Just it's a public ledger, right? Bitcoin is a public ledger, so that should that public data be public? In my opinion, absolutely yes, unequivocally. How financial systems that each department or each jurisdiction, each agency operate, that is a coordination effort, primarily operational, not necessarily technical. There are technical aspects, but getting your financial system to operate with or on chain, I think that could be a huge win. Again, there's a large surface area there. We're talking thousands and thousands of systems. And then something that's kind of near and dear to my heart is public service delivery. Things like how do citizens interact with government on a daily basis? And right now there are several different methods to do this. There are idea portals where you can go and submit your idea. There are customer satisfaction forms, and then there are 311 programs, which are sort of catch-alls for anything. But these are sort of like help desk systems, and where you can basically submit a request. Hey, I need my pothole filled. I would like to submit my recommendation about education. Ultimately, this feedback comes in from all these different directions, right? There's, say, 100,000 citizens in a city, feeding all this information to one place. Well, this needs to then be coordinated back into the internals of government. And so maybe there's 15 different departments inside of an agency. And there's these implicit workflows that happen based on the type of feedback. So if I say I need my pothole fixed, well, it's a dynamic routing problem. And so how that piece of information travels through the different states that it takes in order to get a resolution, I think is very interesting, and it's a general class of workflow problem, which I think the blockchain is very well suited for, around state management, about event, it's essentially an event log. So governments can craft their workflows, and the blockchain can sort of power that in a way that goes between agencies and goes between sort of the organizational silos that it traditionally operates in order to provide a more coherent, unique, just a more coherent experience to the public user, rather than having to sort of operate with each individual silo on its own and then sort of knit together a coherent experience. Like if I'm getting a business license, I have to go, talk to the business group, and then I have to go talk to the tax group, and then I have to file something with like the assessor or the recorder. Like all of that should be done internally. Like my experience is getting a business license, but governments have, they suffer from Conway's law, which is they hoist their internal structure out onto the citizen or onto the user, and that just makes for a very poor user experience. And I think that ultimately the blockchain will help craft more user-centered, citizen-centered services.
How much ability is there to infiltrate or influence some of the larger kind of bureaucratic organizations like FDA, EPA, AMA, these sorts of groups that have sort of a large say in terms of what becomes acceptable, or in terms of implementing policy, and often maybe leverage like a lot of internal or funded research to help make those decisions. It seems like there's a lot of room for increased like efficiency and trustworthiness through having maybe more transparent research methods as an example, but do you see that being on the sort of level of penetrability that maybe you see more local government and state governments presenting in terms of opportunity?
Yeah, I mean the federal level is very difficult, and to be honest, I don't really have insight into their operations, for those agencies. The notion of transparent research could potentially lead to operational changes and efficiencies, but I don't really have insight there. I think, and I think about the surface area, or how many citizens interact with those agencies directly, as opposed to sort of are impacted by the outcomes that come out of those agencies. And to be honest, I don't really have a lot of insight there. But at the local level, which is, I believe all politics is local, the surface area is huge. It's much easier to penetrate the market. It's much easier to explore, especially with the notion of, we have laboratories of democracy. Well, we need to be running many experiments. We need to be testing at the small level, building trust in the technology, into the processes that surround the technology, into sort of understanding the patterns that happen when you introduce blockchain into an agency. Like what are the design patterns that sort of pop out of that? I think we need to understand that a lot more, and again, there's a much longer tail of opportunity at the local level. 50 states, 3,000 counties, we're already seeing it, and then 16,000 towns and cities. You see what that surface area is. The dollar amounts might not be multi-millions like they might be at the federal level, but I think there are plenty of business opportunities at the bottom, and as the technology takes hold, and as people within government and outside of government see what it can offer and experience sort of the transformative effects of having immutable data that's always online, then it becomes foundational for sort of a new generation of expectations around what our government can do, and ultimately the quality and level of public services that we receive, I think, will be remarkable.
Yeah. So in that vein, one of my favorite things about Bitcoin is that everybody has their 9 to 5 job, and so we have all these Bitcoin enthusiasts who are experts in some other field, and their brain's always like thinking, how can I use Bitcoin to improve the field that my expertise is in? So with your expertise being in local government, like what would you say, is the current understanding and attitude towards Bitcoin within local government if they're aware of it?
Yeah, so Bitcoin specifically, I would say like almost non-existent. Except for the people that are poking at this on the side. I think blockchain in the last couple of years is definitely on people's mind. Um, what that means to different people, I think, varies a lot. I think the notion of a ledger makes sense to a lot of people in government. I think finance is kind of core to a lot of government operations, and again, it's something that people can't really disagree with. Yes, we need a ledger. We already use a ledger. Okay, that makes sense. How can we leverage it? I'm not quite so sure yet. But the notion of a blockchain is on a lot of people's mind. Um, my concern is that it's sort of been sold as a solve all, as like a silver bullet, and it's not going to be that. It's always going to leave people with missed expectations, because there is so much, it's so overhyped and it's overmarketed. And again, it's just a tool. It's a one piece of technology that, if introduced, has so many implicit operational changes that are required, and introducing just basic software into government is a challenge, based on all those same issues. So, doing something on the blockchain, um, I think I just don't think they're quite there yet. Something that I think is very interesting, though, is Bitcoin being a public blockchain can help sidestep a lot of sort of what I'd say like organizational dependencies that would have to happen. So I've seen projects like a government or even private corporations who adopt a blockchain, and they have to create these governance structures in order to just manage their own private blockchain. And whether that's a good idea or not, I'll kind of leave that on the side. But that work in and of itself isn't delivering value to users. It's just governance, and it's another layer of governance. And so if you use the public blockchain, you can just get right to delivering value. You can just leverage an existing chain. You encrypt the data. You put it out there. It's publicly available. Arguably, it should already be publicly available. And so I think I don't think people are there yet generally. I think there's a huge opportunity to educate the market and ultimately to show, because there's been a lot of telling around the blockchain sector for the last few years. I mean, it's rampant. I think every CIO and innovation officer and information officer and frankly even boards have gotten briefings on blockchain and why you need to buy this corporate blockchain. But I think this is sort of even akin to my experience, which is like just see a use case that makes sense, put your hands on it, experience what it's like, and then that's where that transformation will come through. That understanding will come from use, and more showing and less telling. Yeah.
The values in the use. I don't know. I've never heard that before. So,
Indeed.
Speaking of show, don't tell, if you want to share, are you working on anything in this area? Is there anything that you're building, or just anything in the works with you related to Bitcoin?
I have some projects that are non-public sector related, and we can talk about those another time. But something I will share is that uh, approaching the public sector with a technology first blockchain pitch is something that I think there's less and less appetite for right now. I think there's this kind of hangover from the last few years about these missed promises. Buy our corporate blockchain solution, and then people that have done that aren't seeing the benefits of that. And so I've been poking around other aspects of it, and other things that the blockchain can do. And I've been having a lot of luck around high data availability. But more so, I've been having luck around discussing identity and how blockchain can potentially relieve governments of having to manage a lot of PII on through their systems themselves. If I'm a government and I want to interact with citizens, and I'm having to take personally identifiable information, well, my risk profile for all of those systems goes up, which means my costs go up, which means my the potential liability is higher, and ultimately, if there is a way to push some of this back to the user by having them have a authoritative digital identity that is proofed by potentially a government such as the federal government or their local jurisdiction in an immutable, trustworthy way, that reduces the amount of information I have to hold within my systems, and it increases the capabilities of me to serve that customer in a new way. So then the notion of identity is very interesting. It's very central to our experience as citizens who interact with government. If you're going to the DMV or you're doing a business license or anything, you're having to fork over all of the same information over and over and over again, which means in the back end it's being persisted over and over and over again, and there's really no coordination around that between system to system to system. And I think there's a lot of opportunity there. The implementation is not going to be trivial, but I think the value proposition is very, very clear to both administrators within government and citizens.
Well, that's all fantastic stuff, and it leaves me feeling very optimistic about the future of government and what they'll be able to provide, and what the expectations will be, which I think is just as important. And I just want to thank you for your time, for coming on with us, and being a part of our show, helping us through some of the technical kinks earlier before we actually logged on. So, Ryan, really want to thank you again.
Thank you both. Really appreciate it.
All right, guys.
All right, guys. Catch you soon. Happy Friday.
You too.